Hey everybody, CyberTao back with you. We've got our series with covering the World Chess Championship right now, and then we have our series with Cal going as well. Give those a check out as well. I thought it'd be interesting to look back at some of the games that Carlsen and Nepomniachtchi have played before this match. In any terms of match situation, the games the individuals have played before adds to a lot to the context. They're about the same age, and they came up to more or less together. In a lot of the same junior events, so they have a lot of rich history with one another. Nepomniachtchi actually leads in their lifetime series, which is something I cited to say that this would be Carlsen's toughest match so far. So I wanted to look back at some of the decisive games they've gotten into to this point. Unfortunately, in classical games, not a lot of them, but this is a game that they played in 2002. I believe they were both 12 years old at this time. Neither of them were like this sort of child prodigy, like a Sammy Reshevsky, where they were, destroying some of the best players in the world when they were 7 or 8. They came up, at least for these days, a little bit later. It's a strange world where 12 is considered slightly too old to be a child prodigy, but so it is. This is a game they played in one of the World Under 12 events. Nepomniachtchi was white. E4, so his repertoire hasn't changed too much in the years. Knight f6, but Carlsen's has. We're going to have a series looking at some of Carlsen's game in the past as well. But just in context of Magnus Carlsen, he used to have a completely different style than what he has now. When he was coming up as a junior and improving and first becoming a grandmaster, he had an incredibly aggressive style. In some of the games that first got him noticed on the world stage, his game against Sipka Ernst in 2004 comes to mind. These were incredibly aggressive sacrificial games where he was just playing for mate for more or less move one. So Knight f6, it might boggle the mind to imagine Magnus Carlsen playing Knight f6 now. This is known as a fairly offbeat and aggressive opening. But it was pretty much part and parcel for those days. He came up with a very youthful, aggressive style. E5, it's the only move that goes for an advantage. I mean, white can play Knight c3 and allow it to transpose to a Vienna, but this is, it's been a while since anyone considered the Vienna as the advantageous opening for white. Knight d5, I must mention Knight g8. This would be the ultimate in provocation. I know Joel Benjamin has played this a few times. I believe this actually has a name. It's called the Brooklyn defense. This is a little bit too much from black, but it's just something fun to play in Blitz. But this is the main line, Aliakin, or Alokin. I believe that's how you say it. Knight f3 was played. d4 is the main move order because this keeps all of white's options in mind. The most aggressive option, f4, is the 4 pawns attack. And this is a crucial test for basically any hyper-modern opening, like the King's Indian, the Benoni, the Nimzo Indian, getting the f-pawn involved in fighting for the center. If your opponent allows you to take the center, a lot of times it's just best to call his bluff and take as much center as you can. This used to be very popular in the 20s and 30s and 40s when the Alokan was still coming up and still relatively popular. Now white's sort of gone for quieter options, but there's nothing wrong with it. It's just pure fashion. I will say psychologically, when someone plays the Alokan, they're looking for a sharp fight, so playing a quiet line against them is typically a good psychological choice. Knight f3 isn't bad, it just takes away a couple of white's options. So d6, we allow this wedge on e5, and then we start fighting against it with the pawn on d6. That's exactly the point of the opening. d4, support the wedge. dx e5, bishop g4 is the main line nowadays. Just some quick opening theory. This was seen in one of the Fischer-Spassky games in 1972. This is actually a main line. So basically, black gives up a humongous amount of space on every part of the board, and gives up the bishop pair, and he's hoping to try to prove that he's got enough pawn breaks, plus white's pawns are a little bit weak over here. Black is hoping to prove that that's enough to compensate. It's not. I mean, this is an incredibly favorable position for white, both theoretically and practically. But it's still an interesting position. But dx dxc5 is even more provocative. g6, I must mention knight d7, and objectively this has to be given a dubious mark. This is the ultimate in provocation. The most infamous game of this was a Tal-Larsen game from their 1965 Candidates semifinal match. Larsen played this, and then Tal went into the tank. I believe he thought for almost 50 minutes. And you would think, I mean, when you consider the figure of Mikhail Tal, you would figure that move would be played within a few minutes, whether it's sound or not. It's actually the best move in this position. It's completely sound sacrifice. Tal, very uncharacteristically, I won't say chickened out because that's disrespectful to the legend, but he chose discretion for maybe the first time in his life. But here, knight xf7 is completely correct. And c4 seems to be the move that theory is decided is strongest. White does have a bailout option here if he wants to draw for some reason. Because black can avoid that, because here c4 is even stronger. But the brief theoretical situation on this, queen f7 is seen as the best move here. And the only move to fight for the advantage, but it's sufficient. But white has an excellent attack here. That's easy to say after decades of analysis, but with the clock ticking into Candidates' semifinal match, things aren't so easy. But g6 was played. Knight c3, the knight doesn't belong here. It's not a terrible move. I mean, it's never that bad of an idea to develop. But whenever you see these sorts of structures, blocking the c-pawn needs to be taken under extreme advisement, because a lot of times that c-pawn is going to end up being very useful, whether it's to go to c3 to support the d-pawn, or to c4 to kick this knight away. So, better just castle. And then knight f3. This is a key move. Black has less space than white, and typically when you have an advantage in space, you don't want to allow your opponent to trade pieces off. So white simply retreats that knight, doesn't allow black to trade pieces off, and now white is eventually positioned to play c4 to kick that knight away in d5. White is a very strong position. Knight c3 doesn't throw the advantage away, but the knight's just a little bit strange there. There's no way to force this knight on d5 away with brute force. b6, castle. Queen f3. I feel bad giving this move a dubious mark, because if Nepomniachtchi played a move like this in the match, I'd be thrilled. But bringing the queen out too early, it's not the strongest move. Knight xd5 is strongest. I'll just show a quick line. Knight d3, and this is a key move that I'd like to explore for a little bit. You often see this pawn structure coming up in Queen's Gambit Declined exchange variations, or Caro-Kann exchange variations. It's also referred to as the Carlsbad pawn structure, and this is ubiquitous across a wide range of openings. In in that structure, a lot of times the knight coming to d3, or if black has a pawn structure, the knight on d6 is absolutely key. And this is shown in the games of Petrosian, a couple by Kasparov as well. The knight is perfectly placed there. It bogs down the b5, b4 pawn break that'll eventually come. It observes the c5 and e5 outpost squares. It cuts back on the e5 pawn break from black. Basically, the knight fulfills every defensive, prophylactic, and attacking role that you could ask it to in that square. Whenever you get this Carlsbad pawn structure, just keep in mind that long-term, the ultimate goal is to get one of your knights to that key square, either on d3 or d6, and strengthens your position quite a bit. Here, white would have a solid advantage. So, queen f3, just a little bit. I mean, I would love to see a move like this tomorrow, so I won't speak too badly of it. Bishop g7, rook e1. Rook d1 is best. Aim to put your rooks on open files. Here, rook d1 wouldn't be an open file just yet, but it would be aiming at the file that's soon to be opened. Best move is castle. If black chooses to take, now we see why we moved this rook to d1. This rook makes complete sense on this open file. And then this is a very dangerous pawn sacrifice from white, which more or less black has to accept, because if black doesn't take the pawn on h2, more or less white's just cutting off that castling and keeping the king stuck in the center for free. But Here, this is a very dangerous position for black. White easily has more than enough for the pawn. So castles is more circumspect. Queen e2. And here, the rook fulfilled a useful prophylactic role in guarding this pawn on d4. White's a little bit more comfortable here. I don't want to overstate the size of the advantage, but it's a little bit of an edge. Rook e1, it's going to be biting on granite soon. Castle, queen g3, knight takes. So now we can see the rook being on e1 ended up not being the file we wanted it on. The e file is not the open file in this case. So this rook's either going to continue to be passive, or white's going to have to spend another move improving the rook. Knight c3, queen c3. Notice if white tries to mangle black's pawn structure, knight e2 check is sadness. So queen c3 is forced. Queen d5. So already Magnus Carlsen is showing his grasp of endgame technique. This is a superb move. So white definitely doesn't want to trade. Black is slightly better here, and black will be slightly better for the next 40 moves, and black can play for 2 results only. Basically, black has a slightly better bishop because this pawn is on a dark square. White doesn't have any pawn breaks, whereas black can eventually prepare to play b5 and b4, breaking open the queen side for play. White is passive and doesn't have any pawn breaks. Black has the only idea on the board, so this is a position where black can just play this on and on forever. So Nepomniachtchi avoids that fate and plays queen e2, bishop g5. Some of these moves you can quibble with, and I have a couple of them in the notes, but this is a lot of shifting in a fairly boring position. Queen f5. Quick note here, queen e4, rook fd8 would be better, because in this particular position, I always tell my students there's good double pawns and there's bad double pawns. In this particular situation, these are not bad double pawns. They aren't a weakness. They can't really be attacked by white. And black just saves the tempo and moving his queen again. And now he's got command of the only open file on the board. This would be a nice little edge for black. c3. h4 is superior. Basically, black has a clear plan of keeping a hold on the d file and then pressuring the e pawn, or gaining pressure on the queen side, or both in conjunction with one another. White needs to find play of his own, and h4 is sort of a thematic way of trying to look for a kingside break. And white's subtle enough here. I mean, maybe long-term, white could think about a g4 pawn break to get counterplay. More likely, white will just stay in place and force black to find a way to win. h3. Rook d3. h6 is more accurate here. Basically, the pawn on e5 is black's target, so h6 is designed to fight for that pawn by enforcing the g5 pawn break. So we force this weakening move of h4, king h7 to guard this h6 pawn. Now black has a few targets. He's got the e5 pawn. We've provoked h4, so now this pawn on h4 is a little bit tender. Or long term, black could play queen f5 and then a move like g5 as a way of continuing to weaken the e pawn. This would be a comfortable advantage for black. He can play this for a while. 5. This is a direct error, so this creates a huge weakness on the queen side that white's able to exploit. h5 would be superior here. And then c5. And having the ability to play c5 is crucial because it prevents white from playing bishop d4 effectively. One particular line. And black's fine. The rook isn't going to be trapped. This could continue something like this. Yeah, just take. And this is dead equal. This is a drawn double rook ending. But b5 is a direct error. And now, it's thematic, because when you have your bishop on dark squares, you typically want to put your pawns on light squares. But here, it has a tactical flaw. a6 was played. This sort of makes sense positionally because it fixes this weakness on a7. But bishop e3 is superior because it immediately aims at that pawn. And if black takes time to save that, bishop d4, and suddenly this rook is in some trouble here. All of this is forced. Queen f3 to guard the rook. And then rook a d1, and suddenly this rook on f3 is going to be trapped by king g2. And there's no good way for... I mean, black can try to get a pawn and a bishop before he loses the rook, but it's just not enough. So a6 misses that tactical opportunity. c5, queen e4. Queen g4 is better. Try to get the queens off the board. And then white's counterplay against these weak queenside pawns doesn't have a counterbalance on the other side of the board. Queen d5. This is way too indirect. This would aim directly for the weakness on e5. Basically, when you have this many weaknesses on the board, you have to play very concretely and move by move. So one error can swing the balance pretty quickly. Then queen b6 hitting this rook. And if the rook goes back, we can just play back. Don't play that. We can just go back to e6. And then we can ask white how he's going to make progress. So queen d5 is a direct error. White is very happy to get the queens off the board. Because now any attack on these weak pawns, white doesn't have to worry about counterplay against his king or this e-pawn with the strong black queen. It's just the rooks and the bishop on the board now. Rook a5, king f1 is a little bit more accurate. And then b3. This is a thematic move in this sort of endgame. Again, when you have same color bishops on the board, typically the side that can get their pawns on the opposite color fastest is going to be in a better situation. So white will have the move c4, and then both the c5 pawn and the a7 pawn will be stuck in the same color as my bishop, which means any bishop ending, I'm going to either win those immediately or just tie the other bishop down passively defending them. This would be a very strong position for white. Okay, 5, c4. So this is why getting b3 in was a little bit important. Now these pawns, again, black here is the one successful in getting the pawns on the opposite color of the bishop. So now these pawns are strong. These pawns here are a little bit weakened by the fact they're stuck on dark squares. King f1, e6. Again, black continues the program, get the pawns in the opposite color of the bishops. But the only pawn left on the board that's stuck in a dark square is black's major weakness, because that pawn on a7 is stuck in place, and white's bishop can basically target it forever. So this is still a little bit tricky for black. Bishop f8, rook b1. So again, when you're looking for plans, always look to your pawn breaks. Pawn breaks are sort of the engine of the position in creating play. So here, white's only remaining pawn break that makes sense is b3. So rook b1 prepares that b3 move. And then b3. Bishop d8, this is natural. It is hard to find the move that draws, especially for a 12-year-old, even a super strong 12-year-old like that. Bishop e4 saves the game just barely. So if the pawn takes, just rook takes, and then c3, black's getting enough counterplay in time. And black is down a pawn, but black has a humongous amount of counterplay, and suddenly the pawn on a6, the pawn on b3, the pawn on e5, these are all weaknesses that black's going to be able to attack with his active rooks. Both his rooks are on open files. This one's already attacking the a6 pawn. Black has enough counterplay here. The other lines here, if white just tries to retreat, bishop c5 liquidates everything in time. This will be a draw and double rook ending. And then c4 is possible. This is the trickiest because it's letting our rook hang but hitting the rook on d5. This is basically a forced variation. And then the key move to all this, just rook d7. And the black rook is hitting the key f2 pawn. The only way to guard it is to go back with the king. And then we just retreat. And letting the kingside pawns drop off is incredibly dangerous. White should just take the draw here. So these variations are relatively simple when you're just analyzing the piece of your own home. But under pressure and defending a slightly worse position, it is very hard to see a move like bishop b4. Bishop d8 looks natural because it kicks out the active rook. But this is still losing for black. Carlsen takes on d4 just to sacrifice the exchange for hopefully enough play. Taking on b3 is the most tenacious, but after rook x b3, both the b5 pawn and the a7 pawn are critically weak here. f6. This is black's best try for counterplay. But this is a technically winning endgame for white. Black has all these pawn weaknesses to hold, and it's just impossible to hold all of them. White's going to double up and try to win the b pawn, and then move his rook to b7 to finish off winning that pawn. This should just be an easy win for white. Rook x d4 tries to complicate things. b4, this is a little bit of an error. Rook c1 is stronger, provoking the b4 move. But again, it's on the same color as the bishop, so it's actually a little bit weakens his bishop's scope a little bit. King e2. And f4. And white's just going to continue with king e3, king e4, and then play d5. And this rook on b5 is stuck holding the b4 pawn. So this should be this is a technically winning position for white. b4 doesn't throw away the win, but it makes things a little bit more complicated. Bishop g5. Notice that this doesn't work out for black, unfortunately. Now the king will just come to e4. And that'll force the one pair of rooks to come off, and white will just have a winning position. d1. Rook c7. This is the final real mistake. Bishop d2 is the most tenacious. The only move... white needs to give back the exchange now. If the king comes to e2, black takes in d4, and then white just needs to bail out into the draw, because suddenly rook x b4 is threatened, or rook e4 followed by rook x d5, and black suddenly has winning chances. So taking in d2 is forced. King f8. If rook c7... This is sort of the key to this variation. If you took away the queenside pawns, this would be a draw. 4 versus 3 on the king side is nearly always a draw, excepting for exceptional circumstances or weird tactical variations. But that would be a dead draw. So adding the queenside pawns does add more winning chances for white. If I had to guess, I would say this is probably a win for white, but this is no sure thing. This is a position where black can defend tenaciously and treat it like a rook endgame. Rook endings are very hard to win, so taking shelter in this would be the best way for black to try to hold the game. So rook c7 would be the most tenacious. King f8 sort of puts off that move. And then white just comes to rook c2. Wins pretty easily. So that would be the most tenacious. Rook c7. Just rook c2. And then d5. And then this is where Carlsen finally resigned. This is just, the bishop's going to move, and then just rook x b5. So, very interesting game. Unfortunately, we haven't seen a game this dramatic yet in the World Championship. There's hope, but it sort of shows the energy and the strength that they were already bringing to games, even at the age of 12. They were already playing very impressive chess. Nepomniachtchi was 2,300, Carlsen was 2,200. They were already playing very rich and deep and interesting games. And they've been competing against each other for quite a while now. So, interesting stuff. We're going to come back to this hopefully tomorrow to look at another game that they've played in the past. So, my name is John. I'll see you then.